Good evening, good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of the Myriad show with your host, 𝐵𝐸𝑒𝑒𝑒. Today, we will be joined by three special guests. It's been, as Brother Abdul-Hakim mentioned just before we started, all good things come to those who wait, and no good thing comes to those who, no good things come to those, I forgot what he said, easy? What did you say?
Anything that's worth doing is difficult to arrange.
Anything that is good, worth doing, is difficult to arrange. So the background to this is that we've been trying to arrange this for some time now, but due to everyone's availability, people being busy, people being on annual leave, etc., we haven't managed to do it, but we finally got there, alhamdulillah. So this episode, we're going to be discussing all things football, racism, and linking it to, or is there a link to, colonial history, right? So you got myself, 𝐵𝐸𝑒𝑒𝑒, we've got Dr. Fahad Qureshi, Dr. Remy Salisbury, and Abdul-Hakim Adebayi. Good to see you guys. How you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Very good, thank you.
I haven't seen you guys for a while.
That's probably because of the pandemic, I'd have thought.
Yeah? Is that
It's not that we don't like you or anything like that.
Are you sure?
Well, that's the excuse I'm using.
All right, brilliant. So I got you guys in for a reason, and that reason is because during the pandemic, initially, there was a massive halt to the game of football, the sport that we love, right? The sport that we probably haven't played for a while, and I'm going to be playing tomorrow for the first time after such a long time, and I cannot wait, right? And that is football, right? So the Premier League season was put to a halt, but then recently it resumed, and unfortunately, the wrong team wearing red have won the Premier League, right?
Absolutely.
And yeah, so for us, all four of us are Manchester United fans, right? We follow the right team. Yeah?
Agreed. Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, cool. How do you feel about Liverpool winning the league?
Yeah,
I think it was. I think it was a fluky title, and I don't really think that any serious football fans will look back at it and count it as a real trophy. To be honest with you, it's just lucky. They did it when like the rules were relaxed and everything, so they were bringing on like 10 substitutions and drinks every 10 minutes and stuff like that. It's just not fair. So
Okay.
it's just one of those fake, just to keep them happy in that, and not start any issues. So I think it's just one of those ones. Real football fans know the sort of how accurate we can call this a title.
Okay. What do you make of it, Remy?
I'm a bit of an odd United fan in that I don't really hold this massive hate for Liverpool. When United play Liverpool, obviously, I want United to beat them. I generally want Liverpool to lose, as I want the better teams to lose against the weaker team. But as far as sides go in terms of the players, the personalities they've got, I think this Liverpool team with Salah and Mane, I think they're quite likeable. Jurgen Klopp's a socialist. I lived in Liverpool for a few years as well, so I think I've got a bit of an affinity to the people there. I know you're probably all looking at me, as everyone in Manchester does, as if I'm a bit mad for not holding this Manchester-Liverpool rivalry, but yeah, it's not that deep for me. I don't hate them any more than I hate City.
Okay, fair enough. What about you, Abdul-Hakim?
Oh no, I'm the complete contrary. I hate them with a passion. Always have done. I've absolutely no idea where the dislike between Mancunians and Liverpool's comes from, apart from the fact that we're obviously relatively close neighbours, and during the 70s, Liverpool dominated absolutely, well, 70s and 80s, Liverpool dominated everything. But actually, similar to what Remy said, I find myself actually quite liking Jurgen Klopp, even though I've tried to hate him, because he actually does seem to say sensible things. He seems to actually have a decent philosophy on life. I like Mane, I like Salah, which is very difficult for me, because when one of those two scores, I want to hate them, but then you hear about what they're doing off the pitch, and you're thinking they're actually genuinely nice people. So it's a horrible situation to be in for a Manchester United fan, but at the end of the day, it's a game of football. Liverpool actually, whether they win it this year, next year, whatever, they've already got more trophies than Man United. So, Man United and Liverpool are the most successful clubs in the UK, and that's probably going to sustain for quite some period of time. So I'd rather spread my hatred towards people like Chelsea, so that they never come anywhere close to Man United. But yeah, no, I'm not. If you'd asked me about 10 years ago, I'd probably have stronger feelings. But now, as you get older, you get a bit more mellow, and it's like, well, it's a game of football. I enjoy watching it. I prefer Liverpool didn't win, but they've won, and they're going to win more. So it's not going to be the last time they win a trophy. So
for me, the problem is that Liverpool hold every major competition in the world right now. So they're the holders of the Champions League, they're the holders of the Premier League, the Super Cup, the FIFA World Club Cup, and those four competitions, and it's horrible seeing that on screen.
Well, you see, for youngsters like you, 𝐸𝐚𝐻, it is horrible. But if you grew up in the 70s and the 80s, that's all you saw. And not only did you see that, but United hadn't won anything for about 20 odd years.
And that's why we've got you on today, because we need the elder statesmen to give that perspective on football during the 70s, the 80s. I was around during the 90s though, so I can, yeah. Right, so that does nicely bring us on to what we're going to be speaking about, which is when the Football League resumed, when the Premier League resumed, there was we were in the midst of the whole Black Lives Matter movement in the UK, the spike in the movement, and that was as a result of the tragic murder of George Floyd in the US, and that triggered all sorts of different conversations that always need to be had, but for some reason they're not being had. And the Premier League, which I was very surprised at, considering their stance on political, putting themselves forward in terms of highlighting political causes, because normally they try and keep neutral on these issues, but with this particular matter, they felt that they had to join the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, we mentioned a few players you just mentioned, Remy, that you like some of the players in the Liverpool team. You've got Mane, Salah, Firmino, and the first three names you mentioned were international players, right? Players that are of colour, players that are black. You've got an African player on there, and yet we're still talking about Black Lives Matter, right? You've got the top clubs in the Premier League, like Manchester United. If you look at their first team, it's full of black players. You've got the Liverpool team. You've got a fair few black players playing in their midfield as well as their star players up front. You've got Van Dijk at the back. You've also got with Chelsea, you've got Tammy Abraham, Willian, and many others. You've got players playing for all the top clubs. Why are we still discussing Black Lives Matter, and why are we discussing racism in football in 2020?
Is that to anyone particular, or?
Yeah, go on, you can start.
We're discussing it because you have racism in society in 2020. So people always try and understand why there's institutionalized racism in certain arenas, but that's because institutions are made of individuals. So if you have racist individuals, then you're going to get racist institutions. And I've actually, I don't know if you watched the program on about Stephen Lawrence and almost on this topic, and John Barnes was speaking, and actually made a really good point, because he talked about, you have certain people who are considered to be elevated out of blackness. So you have presidents, obviously Obama, you have different areas where you have business leaders, very few of them, but you have business leaders, and people almost look at those, and people like Lewis Hamilton, where people, oh, well, there can't be racism because you have those individuals. But as John Barnes said, until the black man on the street in Brixton, or the black man on the street in Toxteth, or the black man in the street in Moss Side is seen as equivalent to his white counterpart, then you're going to have problems. Simply. It doesn't matter how many, they talk about, well, get more black people in the police, and the police won't be racist. Well, you had black people in the world wars. you have black people in football. Just because you have black representation doesn't lead to a lack of racism. Yeah. Because if the institution's racist, the institution's racist. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I think that's the key point, isn't it? Representation itself isn't enough because it doesn't do anything about, it doesn't do anything to end racism, because what you typically find is that when black people are included, they're not typically included in those areas of authority, decision-making, where they can have any real influence. We've just talked about the number of black players in the Premier League. And that's interesting to compare that with the number of black people in positions of management, coaching, even like governing bodies and stuff like that, right? So I think that what's interesting there is that it's about understanding. It's about how we understand racism. Racism is about privileges and benefits. So we're happy for black people to be involved if we can gain some privileges and benefits for them. But when it comes to leading, decision making, and things of that nature, we're not interested anymore. So the thing is, representation on its own isn't enough. There's that sort of mantra: representation without politics is meaningless, and I think that's accurate. I mean, even if you compare it to other sort of sectors, right? Other sports areas, whether it be Formula One, for example, but also other sectors, Hollywood and places like that. You have quite a number of black actors now that are quite prominent, but we've still got massive racism. There's every single year in the Oscars, for example, we have the same debate about the lack of black people being nominated for key awards. So the issue, so racism is a societal-wide issue, and sport reflects the racism of society. But similarly, representation itself isn't enough to deal with the issues of racism as we understand them as endemic, institutional, systemic problems.
Dr. Remy Joseph.
Sorry, Glenn. I think I've got a slight delay. I think another thing to point out is that having black people in football is entirely consistent with the racist ideology that we've had for the past 500 years. Black people are allowed to be sports people because they have that. That's not to understate the difficulties that black people of the past have had to overcome. But black people have long since been imagined as being physically capable, physically superior, to have this athletic prowess. So black people playing football, it doesn't really disrupt this ideology. And of course, the flip side of that it's tied to, is that white people are seen as being intelligent. We've got the white mind, whereas black people, it's just body and physicality. And that might speak to a little bit why there's a lack of, or the absence of black people in management, which I assume is based on an assumption that management takes a particular level of intellect that a lot of black people supposedly don't possess. I think another thing to say about the Black Lives Matter protests in football is to question how much introspection about football itself is tied up with that. And I think there's a certain amount of performative anti-racism in challenging individual racists in the stands, but I don't think that the taking of a knee is not translating into questions about institutional racism in football.
Yeah, and that's a brilliant point, Remy. And I just realised when I introduced you, I didn't introduce you properly. It's Remy Joseph Salisbury, not Remy Salisbury. Right. So Remy, that's an excellent point, because we've had footballers introduced into the English league. I think during the 60s, maybe 70s, definitely, and then the 80s you had John Barnes, and at that time they faced racism from the stands. There was all sorts of names and there were taunts that were thrown in their way, and over time we've seen the eradication of that. But obviously there's been the reintroduction, and there's been certain spikes in certain stadiums over the past year or so, and it does happen in Europe. But I guess there needs to be a differentiation between that and then the institutional racism that's embedded within the footballing structures that prevent black players progressing into coaches, into the governing bodies, into managerial positions, into the boardroom, etc. And do you feel like it's exclusively down to these prejudices or these tropes that are held between like, oh, black players, they're athletic, they've got, you know, they're strong, they're fast, but they don't have, you know, quote unquote, they don't have that intelligence to be able to undertake these advanced roles?
I think that's a big part of it. I don't think it's just down to ideology. I think that comes to have material consequences. So that ideology means that there've not been many black managers in the past, which means there's not been that pathway. That pathway is not established. So it becomes normalized that black people are not managers, and that goes on to have effects. But perhaps there are other factors like young black would-be coaches not having networks and the encouragement that their white counterparts could have. So I think there are probably many other factors. I think that's one of them, but I'm sure there are others that I'm not thinking of right now.
I mean, it's also about, where you see a reflection, or where you see you feel like you could go, where you feel like you could be, and where you feel like you could belong. And I think if you don't see your reflections, it's much more difficult for you to feel like you can go into those spaces. And I think that just compounds the issue.
It does, but I think that what Remy said is it's a very powerful point, because I've reflected on this when you look across industries outside of sport. But obviously, sport is in the public eye, so you actually see it more pronounced. But if you look at the language around, and you mentioned it, the language around players, that is automatically going to dictate where they end up. Because if you take four people, Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard, and then you've got Sol Campbell and Ashley Cole, all very similar, distinguished careers, but you never used to hear people talking about the two black players, Ashley Cole and Sol Campbell, about leadership qualities, about intelligence, about all the things that will automatically lead you into a management role. But Steven Gerrard and Frank Lampard always be talked about in those terms. So inevitably, if I'm then looking for a leader, whether it's conscious or unconscious, I'm thinking about who are the leadership people, and I'm thinking about footballers that for the past 20 years I've had drummed into my mind. These are leaders of men. So I'm going to gravitate towards those. Black players are never, and I can say this pretty categorically, I can't think of any black players who have been described as having leadership qualities, being leaders of men. Patrick Vieira, for example, is probably one of the closest that you get to be a leader of men. And where is he? When the Arsenal jobs and those sort of things are up for grabs, Patrick Vieira's name is sort of mentioned, but it never goes to that sort of player. Because they're not seen as leaders of men, because they've never been described. Whenever they talked about Patrick Vieira, he was gazelle-like, he was powerful, he strode, Yaya Toure, again, always descriptions about their physical prowess, not about their footballing intelligence. Even Wayne Rooney, who generally people would not consider to be one of the most intelligent of individuals, whether rightly or wrongly, they did a program on him and started talking about his football intelligence and how his synapses work so rapidly. There's never been a program about that, about any black players who are far more intelligent and far more accomplished than Wayne Rooney.
So do you feel it's a continuation of how they're described during their playing careers and how they're seen in the future? Do you think there's a link?
Yeah, there's a definite link. And if I go back a bit further, I grew up in the 70s, and I don't know if anyone on here remembers a program called St and Greaves. It may have finished by the time you guys were watching football. St and Greaves, Ian St John and Jimmy Greaves, great footballers. They had a program on ITV on a Saturday morning, and I remember when a few African players started coming to the league, they used to say things like, well, black players are not intelligent enough to actually play in midfield. Black people aren't intelligent enough to play up front. because it requires, you know, an understanding of the game, which well, they didn't say black people, actually, they just said Africans. They just said African players don't have that intelligence. If you go back to the early 90s when Cameroon were coming through, they were always talking about, oh, well, yeah, they're very physical, but they don't really understand the game, and all these sorts of descriptions. So if that's what's in your mind, even if you're in a black position, in a position of power, you have been indoctrinated and programmed to believe that the leaders of men, which are going to be determining whether your club or your company are going to be successful, look like that. And they don't look like me, because we're not in those positions. And we're not in those positions not because we're capable of doing it under discrimination, because that requires you to have a bit of self-introspection to say that. It's a lot easier just to say either they don't want the jobs or they're just not capable of the jobs. And that's the situation we find ourselves in across the spectrum.
One of the questions I had, and I guess you kind of touched on it, is you can identify players and value them in your team for certain characteristics, certain skills that they have, but you can still have racist ideas and internalized racist tropes about them, right? So, for example, we know that there's many amazing footballers in the Premier League and in many other international European leagues and beyond, and we admire them. A manager can admire them, the governing structure of that club can admire them, but when it comes to really then taking them above to the next level, there'll be barriers put in place for their progress.
Is that a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, that's an interesting thing to see, but I think that what it does is it's what I said before. It's the representation, but without the politics. But the representation is used as an indication that we're making progress in the fight against racism, simply because we've got black faces that are present. And it goes back to what I said before. A large part of the reason for that is simply because of the benefits that can be accrued from having skillful, good quality black football players in your team that can help you win money. And I think that there's been an interesting sort of development of the relationship between capitalism and racism over the last several decades, where there has been an attempt to co-opt and incorporate more and more people from not just at national level, but also at international level, sort of try and incorporate more and more people from black backgrounds, ethnic minority backgrounds, because what capitalism ultimately is interested in is making more money, right? And so whether it's a capitalism of a European style, whether it's a capitalism of we have this sort of term, the Asian giants, Asian capitalism, Asian variants of capitalism. Ultimately, what the end goal here is about making money. And if black people can help you make money, great, right? And this is part of the reason why more and more now we see sort of with the internationalization of capitalism, we see a much more interesting dynamic where black faces are much more sort of involved in the marketing of major corporations. So I think that's the interesting thing that's going on in football as well, and that's the interesting thing to know. The racism in football is not unique to football. So the racist trends that we see in football are mirrored. They're just simply a reflection of wider societal racism. Of course, the racism in football does have its own sort of unique quirks to it, as Abdul Hakim was saying before, that we focus on physical prowess and things like that. But ultimately, the racism in football is a reflection of broader societal racism. So it's nothing unique, is what I would say to that.
Yeah. So why is football viewed as a non-racist industry where it's full of black representation? You've got players that are winning, as you mentioned now, that are parcel of the marketing of clubs. You had Paul Pogba. I remember when he returned back to Manchester United, right? There was a whole campaign, Pogba, hashtag Pogback. There was his emoji that was created. in his style.
But that's just the marketization of Pogba, isn't it? And using his name, using his image, for financial gain.
Yeah. So how do you explain that to an average person who sees all the symbolism and thinks, actually, no, there isn't any racism. The top player at my club is a black player. The top earner at my club is a black player. He's also, I know he's not the captain, but he was the captain for a while, or the deputy captain under Mourinho, right?
Yeah.
How would you challenge somebody who uses these sort of arguments to counter that there isn't a problem of racism in football?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's, you can look at these issues in a number of different ways, right? And I think that there's two ways to look at it. One is to say, well, this is a sign that, we're winning again in the fight against racism. And the other is to say, well, actually, we're not winning in the fight against racism because it's about how we understand racism, right? So if we understand racism simply as like in tokenistic fashions, then those kinds of arguments lend themselves to thinking that that we are making progress in the fight against racism. But that's not really what racism is. Racism isn't just the limited presence of black people in certain areas. It's much broader than that. So there are other ways to look at it, as I said. So their presence isn't necessarily because of the successful fight against racism. It's because they make money. They help you make money. They have big Instagram profiles. They have big social media presences, and all of that can be marketized and commodified by clubs simply to make more money. So ultimately, in my view, it always comes back down to money. That's what corporations are always interested in. It's always the bottom line. Values and morals shift and move, right? Corporations politically, corporations are neutral. They sit in the center of the political spectrum because they don't really care. They'll sell and make money off anybody at the political spectrum. Okay, and part of the sort of reason that we have seen a depoliticization in wider society is just because of the sort of dominance of marketization and corporations. Corporations are ultimately interested in making money. They don't necessarily care about politics. Politics causes problems, it causes trouble, it causes violence. And when you have that, business suffers. Okay, so I think that there's an interesting parallel going on between depoliticization and marketization at the same time as well.
Okay. Remy, earlier you mentioned that when the Premier League restarted and they got involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, there was an element of just performativism, and there wasn't really that reflection on what that actually meant. Do you feel like most, even when it comes to the football authorities, the footballing, the football clubs themselves, they see racism as an issue in the stands rather than an issue within the governance structures, the club structures, etc.? Is that how they really understand racism? Because we know that, for example, during the Euro qualifiers, there was many all games are behind closed doors now at the moment, but there was some games that were behind closed doors when the fans were allowed, and that was as a result of being punished for racist behaviours. But there seems to be that attribution of racism towards those in the stands, but not that, okay, we need to look at our own behaviours and our own biases.
Yeah, I think that is accurate. But to reiterate what others have said, I don't think this is a problem just about football. I think this is a problem with how our societies view racism more generally. So the popular understanding of racism is of something that is individual and it's interpersonal. It's not something that's embedded in our institutions. The way we think about racism as a society is also deeply classist. So we only really think about working class individuals as being racist. And football is seen as, or is, a working class sport. So I'm not apologising, and I know that there is racism in the stands. I'm not apologising for that, but I'm just saying that we have a propensity to see certain forms of racism and perhaps let other forms, I think forms of racism that are more harmful, go unchallenged. So I think that's a big challenge for football, but a big challenge for society. And a lot of this is based on poor understanding of what racism is. I think if we properly understand what racism is, then we wouldn't mistake having black players in the Premier League as demonstrating the end of racism. Just like we wouldn't mistake the election of Barack Obama meaning the US is no longer racist, or Jessica Ennis Hill, or Meghan Markle, although I know that one is now gone.
Do you feel that's deliberate?
Absolutely, because it vindicates society, it vindicates states, it vindicates institutions. If you can point to individuals and say they're the bad people, they're the bigoted individuals and racists, and if we just deal with them, racism will be gone. Nobody's looking elsewhere. You're not looking at broader issues of where racism comes from, why it still persists 500 years later. What's also interesting is actually the way in which the narrative, the sort of narrative on Black Lives Matter has shifted a little bit as well. And this is also in football. Initially, there was a lot of support for Black Lives Matter and people were taking the knee and so on. But actually interesting now that a lot more people are caveating their support for Black Lives Matter. So the easy part, everybody was involved in that, but the part where now we have to sort of start making tough decisions and allocating money and things like that, that's it. Whether it's in higher education, where we're talking about allocating money for black scholarship, for black scholarship for black students from ethnic minority backgrounds, decolonizing the curriculum. Even if you look at the Labour Party, initially Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer were taking the knee and all the rest of it. But Keir Starmer now saying, Black Lives Matter, and they're talking about defunding the police and absolute nonsense and all of this kind of stuff. So it's everyone's on board when it's easy. And it's easy to say that racism is just an individual problem. It's that person over there. But when it comes to understanding racism in its fullest sense, the conversation shifts quite suddenly.
Yeah, Remy, you do a lot of work in terms of anti-racist education, right? How do you feel this is applicable in this setting? I know you've mentioned that racism isn't a football issue, it's a societal issue, but if we want to educate those in football about racism and not limit it to individual biases that people might have, how do we go about that process?
That's a big question. I think it needs to be embedded in our schools, and if it's embedded in our schools, then those young footballers will be getting this education early. Of course, football academies and clubs themselves should be looking to engage in anti-racist education that looks at racism as a structural problem. But I also don't want to say that this is just a problem of education. If we educate everyone, things will change. Because I think in a lot of cases, people know what's going on. Exactly. People can see the inequalities, but giving up, tackling that inequality means for a lot of people giving up on privilege that they've been enjoying for too long. So
there's a cultivated ignorance around racism.
Yeah.
So you feel that it's in their interests, a lot of people, to willfully look the other way and ignore the issue?
I mean, why wouldn't you? If you're privileging society, if you're accruing so many benefits simply by the nature of who you are and the sort of political identity group that you're a part of, why would you willingly want to give up those kinds of benefits just for some, morals and ethics and all of those kinds of things? It's as Remy said, it's much more than a question of just simply educating people.
Yeah, and I think
people know racism and they understand it.
Yeah, the question you asked earlier about how would you explain to somebody that isn't racism, I think Remy spoke to it very eloquently in terms of first you have to understand what racism is. So I'd firstly want to understand the person who says, well, there's no racism because there's lots of black footballers. I'd ask them, well, what do you mean by when you're describing the term racism? And actually, the very fact that 35% of the footballers in this country are black an ethnic minority, but there's not any black and ethnic minority football managers, directors of football, chairman, speaks exactly to the fact that there must be racism, because even if you only had 2 or 3%, that'd be bad, but you've got less than that, and that statistically just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So that's how I'd start that conversation. And then Remy picked up on about the working class elements, which is what the ruling class have always done, to sort of like push things aside that they want to make sure that they stay in control. Because if you minimize it to being a working class problem, and as long as we can sort out what's going on the terraces and take a knee, then everything will be all right. I mean, I think of the statements Boris Johnson has made about piccaninnies with watermelon smiles. If Steven Gerrard or Wayne Rooney had made that, they'd probably never play football again. They certainly wouldn't be on TV. Yeah, he's the Prime Minister of our country, and very few people mention that anymore. It's almost, oh, well, that was in the past and he made an apology. If a working class white guy had said anything like that, they just wouldn't get anywhere. So so it's not a matter of education, because people like Boris Johnson are historians, and he's a very educated individual, and he understands the power of words, and he understands the historical context of what has happened to black people in this country and through the diaspora. So you can educate people, but as Fahid has said as well, if I have a privilege, there has to be a very compelling reason for me to give up that privilege. And what's the compelling reason in this? What's the compelling reason? I can do things like put a spatting of footballers in there. You get a golfer there. You get a racing driver there. But the power structure still doesn't change. And it's interesting because people think things have changed. And I have this constant conversation with people. Yeah, in the 70s, when I won't mention the name, when a company that my dad worked for basically said to him, 𝐷𝐵𝐸, your work is good, but your face doesn't fit. Yeah, that's changed. They won't say that to me anymore. But if I look at the amount of people in the positions that are frequented by middle-aged white guys, they're still frequented by the same middle-aged white guys as they were in the 70s. They're not going to come to me and say, 𝐷𝐵𝐸, your face doesn't fit. They're not going to do that in a footballing context, but they're not going to get the opportunities. So the challenges still remain. And my view is always, if you go back 40 or 50 years, and I wasn't, or people who look like me weren't considered an equal in terms of mental capacity, and there's still that view that prevails in lots of academic circles, actually. So it's not a matter of education. How on earth would you expect anybody to employ me to do a job which needs intellectual dexterity, when they don't actually see me as their intellectual equal? They don't even see me as an intellectual equal to some animals, and they believe that just by nature of your race, you are automatically relegated to not being as intelligent as another race. And that is still quite a wide-held view in lots of circles.
Yeah.
So how do you change that?
I think as well, that question, Glenn, of what we would say to someone who kind of understands the prevalence of black footballers as showing that racism has been overcome. There's a lot of questions you could just ask back, like, how do black footballers that are playing now understand it? What do they say about their experiences in the game? And then even more so, black players who have spoken about racism in football, what response do they get? What happens when Sol Campbell tries to, and I mean, I'm Sol Campbell conservative, is not front of the list of people that I want to defend, but, you know, I think what he was touching on is important. What happens when he tries to express that racism is a barrier that's shaping his, that's preventing him from becoming a football manager? What happens when other black players try to express these things? But then more widely, even moving beyond football, what does the high proportion of black footballers have to do with black people being 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched, or black and Asian people being more likely to have died in Grenfell? If anything, it serves as a distraction. It actually, people take these things to say racism has been overcome. So then we take our eye off the ball with things like Prevent, things like Grenfell, Windrush, all of these institutional forms of racism.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to that, I think it's what we've been saying, isn't it? Racism is a societal, structural level problem. So when you analyze it and try to make sense of it, you have to think about it at that level. It's not, you can't understand a societal wide problem at an individual level, and to try and make sense of where is it going as a trend. So I think that it goes back to what Remy was saying, doesn't it? That yes, there are individual footballers that are increasing now, coming into football clubs and stuff. But what does that say to the general experience of Black people when it comes to employment, education, access to opportunities, and things of that nature in general? We have at that level, we haven't made any progress. Okay, and so to use these sort of tokenistic gestures as an indication that we've fought against racism, I mean, there's a reason why we do that. It's because it moves the conversation of racism along, and we try not to say as much that there's still a problem with racism because we can point to individuals. So I think that it's quite problematic to focus on just individual cases, and it happens quite a lot.
Yeah.
Just because before I forget the point, and I don't know whether this is actually accurate, because I wasn't alive in the '60s, but all of the old footage I've seen of people like Pelé and Eusebio, interestingly enough, I don't think they used to just talk, because that Pelé was never described as an athlete. They actually talked to him about him as a good and intelligent footballer and look at all his skills. Same thing with Eusebio. So it's interesting that in that like 50s and 60s, maybe because they were a novelty, they didn't just talk about their physical prowess, but by the time it got to the 70s, that's all they talked about. And interestingly, diminished them. So, and I'll just, there's this one point, because I was thinking about it, and if you think of, we're all Man United fans, Best, Law and Charlton, they were described as the Holy Trinity, which is like, obviously they have godlike qualities. If you look at Batterson, 𝘚 I think it wasn't Cyril. Yeah, I think it was 𝘚 and Laurie Cunningham at West Bromwich Albion, they were described as the 3 degrees. There's a reason why one is godlike and the other one's a pop star. And they're all footballers. They're all doing exactly the same thing. They're all quality, but one is likened to just a pop group, and the other one's likened to a godlike creature. And I think that therein lies your challenge in how are you going to deal with this, because that's just the way the mind thinks.
Fahad, you mentioned earlier when I brought up the point about Paul Pogba and his marketization, and the whole fuss that was made about him when he came to Manchester United, and generally football clubs using Black players and players from other minorities to excel. And your sort of argument for that is, well, they want success, right? And their success is identified by prizes, cash, finance, etc. I'm gonna build that into an international. We're gonna bring it to the international arena. So you've got international football teams. You've got the English football team, the French football team, the Belgian football team, and these are European nations. And they've recently, if you look at their teams over the last 10 to 20 years, there's an increasing number of Black players that are playing for them. Now, I know the English team haven't had any success. I think their success was the semi-final of the recent World Cup. But if you look at France, I remember when they won the World Cup a couple of years ago, I was looking into their teams from the 80s and the 90s, and they didn't qualify for 3 major tournaments in a row, 88, 90, 92. I think maybe 4, 94 as well. And then 90.
Yeah, I think it was 90, 94, 96.
Yeah.
Was it something like that?
Yeah, well, it was 3 in a row, and then they flopped in one. And then you had World Cup 98 that was full of players from the former French colonies. And they were either first generation French, second generation, or just naturalized French, so they were born in other countries. And they went on to win the World Cup. right? And at that particular time, there was a lot of the French society was they displayed some form of animosity in terms of they didn't really want to celebrate the World Cup, but then you had others that were like, well, doesn't matter, we won the World Cup, etc. But 20 years on, France won the World Cup again, but there hasn't really been any change in French society. So do you feel like success in football or representation can change attitudes, or do you feel that there needs to be more than that?
Yeah, I think there definitely needs to be more than that. Because clearly it hasn't really done very much, has it? And it never really does anything. And what's interesting is the way in which not only people from ethnic minority backgrounds are allowed into these spaces, but also how we see them in those spaces. You know, he's all right, that one. You know, he's not like the other ones. You can trust him. You know what I mean? So it's about the way in which their blackness almost is constructed around them as less threatening. Or where it comes to Muslims, you know, he's a good Muslim. He's all right. You can trust him. He's not like the others, which in itself is a racist trope. This idea that you have the good ones and you have the bad ones. You have the sort of the ones who are moderate and the ones that are extremists.
But in this case, is it not more just using them for a function, which is to win?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
That they identify, because it's quite obvious. Right?
And you know, all that talent gets hoovered up from other parts of the world.
Yeah, without knowing the internal discussions, it's quite obvious when you look at the squad for Euro 96 and then you look at the squad for World Cup 98. It's just so blatantly obvious that there must have been conversations taking place that, you know what, we're going to allow, in order for us to be successful, we need to have more black players in our team, and we need to give them French nationality, right? Even if they're born in other parts of the world, they're French now, right? My question is, if it probably wasn't clear, was that does that change anything with regard, you know, because they were successful, right? They were successful, and normally when a success, it shows, you know, it's something to be celebrated, and after you celebrate something, attitudes are meant to change, right? But we know.
Just as a point of note there, though, Ghulam, because I don't think there would necessarily have been any conversation, because the French are unique in their colonization, because they still colonized most of Africa. A lot of the revenues from African countries are deposited in the French in French banks, and they have to then ask the French if they want to take the money out, and they have to take loans. So not necessarily all of Africa, but certainly in the Caribbean and lots of other African countries, you're automatically a French citizen, because even though it's no longer a French colony. So Thierry Henry, for example, I can't remember which French island he comes from, but even if he's born in that island, he's a French citizen. So you don't actually have to say, right, I'm going to naturalize you and make you a French citizen. A lot of those people are already French citizens by the virtue of where they're born. So it's a very different colonization to the UK colonization. So you don't. There doesn't have to be a massive conversation about how do we get them in the French team. It's very easy.
You're already French.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you look, just going to be a bit of a football geek here. If you again just go and looking at the relative squads from 1998 onwards, apart from a couple of tournaments, France have like either reached the final or won the tournament, right? So you had World Cup 98, Euro 2000, and then World Cup 2006. They got to the final, but if you remember Zidane, the famous headbutt with Materazzi, and then they lost on penalties, right? And then in 2016, they got to the final again of the Euros, but they lost to Portugal. And then in 2018, they won the World Cup. It's full of players from the French colonies. We also know that in terms of African players in the Premier League, you've got Sane, right? You've got you've had players like Yaya Toure. You've had Drogba, you've had Okocha before that. Internationally, you've got Eto'o, 𝑘𝐚𝐤. You've had all these amazing footballers that have played for their respective African nations, and you've got players from African heritage playing for European countries like France, Belgium, and they've done really well. How come these European nations have had success, but the African nations haven't? If the players exist, if the players are around, and they're amazing footballers. Some of them have won World Football Player of the Year. They've won Premier League Player of the Seasons. They were top scorer in World Cups. Playing for top European clubs, won the Champions League. But when it comes to playing for their respective nations, they don't really progress.
It doesn't help, does it? That
is it a case? I'll ask you one more. I'll ask one more question. That they just simply don't have the discipline.
I can't imagine anyone on this call is going to say that. But if you ask the question more widely, I would imagine a lot of people would say, yeah. It doesn't help that some of the former colonial powers still hoover up all of the players. There's a lot of Algerians playing for France that if they'd played for Algeria at a certain time, that would have been an absolutely amazing team. Still got people like Karim Benzema, Zidane in recent memory.
I mean, even the Belgian World Football Club is amazing.
Yeah,
it's made up of a lot of people.
Absolutely. And then more than that, there's the infrastructure in these countries, the wealth in Europe, the wealth to invest in football academies, in training, the investment in competitions like the European Champions League and the individual leagues. That wealth and that infrastructure is so deeply embedded that it's actually amazing that some of the African nations have got so far in World Cups. And the odds so stacked against them, so unbelievably stacked against them. There's been times, I remember an Ivory Coast team, I can remember a Ghana team and a Nigeria team that have all been absolutely amazing, and there's been moments in each of those World Cups where you thought they could actually do it, but
yeah,
it's.
I think it was Nigeria, wasn't it? 2010 when they was it Uruguay? They got beat by cheating Suarez.
That was Ghana, wasn't it?
Oh, was it Ghana? Sorry, I thought it was Nigeria.
Yeah, it was Ghana.
I've never liked him ever since that point.
Yeah. So
Nigeria was like the 𝐻𝐻𝐿 team, Kanu, Taribo West, 2002.
But to look at that question, and I can see where you try to lead us to, so I'll jump straight in there. So if you look at the managers of those teams, and I think you'll find that none of them are reflected by nationals of that country. So in England, when Fabio Capello took over, and Sven-Göran Eriksson, they're all up in arms because he's not an Englishman. Well, if you look at the Nigerian team, virtually every single one of their managers in recent history has been a Dutchman or whatever. And the no marks, they're not getting quality managers. They're just sticking a white guy in there, and then you think, well, why aren't they winning anything? Well, if you put that same white guy in charge of France, they wouldn't win anything either. So the problem is not just about the fact, although it's a significant fact, that most of the top quality players are then hoovered up by Western countries. And if you live in England and you're a Nigerian and you want to go and play for Nigeria, you're almost vilified. So the chances are, if you're living in the Western side, you're going to play for a Western team. But then the managers of those teams, who are an integral part of determining how successful that team is going to be, is generally a white person. So
that was the case also recently with Wilfried Zaha, wasn't it? He went to play for the Ivory Coast rather than England, and the sort of abuse that was thrown his way, that he bottled it, he didn't want to play for England, and he just wasn't good enough. He didn't have that sort of patience or bravery to challenge for his position. But I watched the recent interview with him and Rio Ferdinand, and he goes, the adulation he receives from the Ivory Coast, like the buzz that he gets from playing, and he was born there, he was raised there in his early childhood, and he came here as an immigrant, and but that nevertheless hasn't stopped all the abuse and the things that they're still writing. They still cannot accept that he chose the Ivory Coast over England.
Yeah, and I think that bit about the way that choice is constructed is really, really powerful and worrying, that he is seen as not being ambitious enough for not choosing the European team. It shapes the way he is then seen as a footballer. You know, he hasn't got the ball to do it. If he cares about his career, then he will play for England because he will play with better players, and then that becomes cyclical. And there's such a backlash against people choosing to play for someone other than in England. It becomes harder and harder for players to do that.
What do you make of the actual, the response to the success of, let's say, the French football team? Because you mentioned earlier, Remy, that it's not just about the race. They look at it from a class perspective. And most of the footballers that made up the French team, they were from the banlieues. They were from the suburbs of France. And there was this, I can't remember the exact stat, but the last World Cup, I think it was something like 30% of the players, not just the French team, but 30% of the actual players in the World Cup were from the banlieues in France. So they played for Algeria, Tunisia. They played for some of the African nations as well, the West African nations as well, and then obviously the French team. But then still, right now, when France won the World Cup, they stopped the trains from the banlieues coming into the French into the city because they didn't want the quote unquote the riffraff coming in. But the riffraff is who won them the World Cup, right? So there's that strange dichotomy, isn't there? There's one hand you want to celebrate him and elevate him and use him and abuse him, but at the same time you're like, okay, we're going to keep you on arm's length.
There's also like a real individual embodiment of that for me, was mentioned before, was Zidane and that headbutt. So he was a French real hero. But that moment when he headbutted Materazzi, and it was mentioned that someone said something about his mum, and then that protection of the mother was seen through a very particular lens that invoked him as an Algerian man. So the moment he failed the French nation, he was Algerian. But before that, if he was going to go on and score, he would have been the French hero in that game.
Well, that's what Benzema said as well. I mean, he doesn't get selected anymore for the French team, but he goes that when I score, I'm an amazing French player, but when I miss and I don't score, I'm an Arab C word, right? Do you think? I know we're talking about the French team, but do you feel that's the case also with English players, where those that play for England from it's only a black background, that their blackness is attributed for any negativity that they might have that might be personal that they bring to the table, but anything good that they do is English and it's white.
I don't even see any of the good that they do is necessarily attributed positively. So you take Raheem Sterling, 2 stories. Yeah. He buys the house for his mum. He's a flash git. I can't remember what white footballer. Oh, the lovely blah blah. Supports his mum to buy a house. Anything Raheem Sterling does, even now, even though he's doing really well, every single thing he does, they try and find a negative way of portraying it. He's flash. He's this. He's he's got a gun tattoo. David Beckham.
Wasn't he being accused of being a member of a gang or something like that as well?
Yeah, exactly.
But that's precisely because he speaks out against racism.
Yes.
Right. No, he's not considered a safe black guy, is he? He's one of those other ones. So he's fair game basically.
And I think just to broaden your point out, because I've thought about this a lot, and the reason why I can sometimes seem very sceptical and have very little hope when you look at football, go back 50 years. So from 50 years coming forward, virtually every single one of the Brazilian teams that have dazzled the footballing stage has been black. Brazil is not a place of equality. The black people in Brazil haven't been elevated because Pelé was black, Garrincha was black. You just go for all the teams, all of their best players generally have been black and working. working class. And Brazil is a very unequal society. Racism there, and it's probably, you'd argue it's even worse because they have such a significant proportion of black people there, and they can't get anywhere. They're not in politics, they're not in higher echelons of football, they're not in any real parts of the power dynamic in Brazilian society, yet they have a significant proportion of black people there, and their sports are dominated by black people. So
that goes back to the question, I guess, I was asking, which is that does sporting success for black players, will that change anything for them in society?
I don't think you can. One thing you can see is how precarious the privilege is that you would get from being a celebrity and a footballer. How much more precarious it is for black players. You know, one wrong move, one slip, and that privilege that is experienced by footballers quickly disappears. You can much more quickly shift from being a hero to a villain if you're a black player than you can if you're a white.
I think Paul Ince said something about that, didn't he? When black guys get into management, there's a much shorter window of opportunity for them to be successful. And if they're not, then it's because they're dumb because they're black, and we made a mistake and correct the mistake as quickly as we possibly can.
Yeah, I think Hakeem, you mentioned the manager to me in a conversation that just always gets jobs, no matter how many times he's failed.
Well, there's several of them. It was great. Finally, they finally found out 𝐸𝐸𝐻. But if you look at John Barnes, he was at Celtic for about one season. He lost against that. I can't remember what the Caledonian Thistle or something in one of their Scottish Cups. He's never had a club since. 𝐸𝐸𝐻 failed every single club he goes to, and he just kept getting jobs. Steve Bruce, another one. They laud him and say, "Oh, he's a great manager." And when I say, "Well, what's he done?" Same thing with David Moyes. Oh, he got the United job based on what? He didn't even win the First Division Championship to get Preston promoted. People don't realise that. He came second.
We've got David Moyes fan here.
He's won absolutely nothing in his career, yet he gets the biggest job in English football. There's absolutely no... For a black person to get that job, he would have to win virtually everything for the previous 10 years to even get a sniff of it. And I'll leave you with this one, because this is a real bugbear of mine, and probably one of the reasons why I don't particularly like Guardiola, and it's not his fault. Barcelona did nothing allegedly before Guardiola.
Yeah.
But as far as I'm concerned, Guardiola took over a team that was already dominating Europe. It was already dominating Spain. The person who revolutionised that team was Frank Rijkaard, because they hadn't won a title for years. They hadn't won a European title for years. Who was the person who brought in Messi? Who was the person who brought in Xavi? Who was the person who brought... All of that team that Guardiola took over was built by Frank Rijkaard, and he has been completely expunged from Barcelona history. They even talk about Cruyff before they talk about right. It's like Rijkaard didn't exist, and he hasn't had. I mean, he's now got a half decent job, but he was in the wilderness for years. A guy who has built a dynasty, and all they talk about is Guardiola. Oh, he's the football he plays. You think, hang on, what about Rijkaard then? What about Ronaldinho? What about all these players that Rijkaard delivered that sort of football to? And he's like, he doesn't exist because he's black. If he'd been a white guy, they'd still be talking about him and giving him plaudits and awards. And that's why I have very little hope, because I just see it not just in football. You look at Lewis Hamilton, and people hate Lewis Hamilton because of exactly the same attributes that they wrote a film play about James Hunt about. He's a womanizer. He's flash. He lives in Monaco. That for a white guy is exciting, and I write a film about him. That for a black guy is you're disloyal, you hate England, and you're too flash. And it's all across society.
Okay. Any final comments, Remy?
I thought I didn't have much to say on this topic, but it turns out once we sit down, there's quite a lot to say. One thing we've not discussed is the unbelievable absence of Asian players in English football.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a whole other conversation or what, but
I think we'll have to have a part 2 about that, because I think I should have been a professional footballer. Isn't it, Hakeem?
I've seen you play.
I'm pretty decent. I've set you up for quite a few goals.
I didn't make any comment. I just said I've seen today.
I know you're insinuating. Fahad?
Yeah, I think we've said everything that needs to be said. I think the point about the Asian football is quite interesting. If you look at the sort of grassroots level, a lot of the quality players are Asian. So something's happening where they're not progressing and they're not getting a chance and they're not getting a shout. It's an interesting one to look at.
Definitely. 𝐷𝐸𝐿?
Yeah, I think I've said enough. But on the Asian one, it's again that stereotype. Asians don't like to go out in the night. The parents won't let them out. I've heard it all.
There's also that thing about their masculinity. They've got weak masculinity. They're not strong enough, and all of that. They can't hack it.
I've heard it all because people. This is interesting. People think because you're black, then I can speak to you about Asians, and it doesn't bother me because I'm not speaking about black people. So I'm not being racist because I'm now talking about the Asians, and they're very different from you, aren't they? So I can give you all the stereotypes about Asians because I think you're all right because you're a black guy and you're not so bad. So yeah, I think it's a whole other podcast when you start talking about that because that's another issue.
Definitely. So we'll have to have a part 2 discussion on that, right? Dr. Romy Joseph Salisbury, Dr. Fahad Qureshi, Abdulhakeem Adebayi, thank you very much for your time. It's been a very, very interesting conversation. I've learned a lot from you guys, and I'd love to have this discussion again in the future. Sometimes where we can delve into some more detail in some of the specific issues that you brought up. Very interesting that you linked it to capitalism. Very interesting that you linked it all to like the hoovering up of talent from all around the world. And I did not know about the French citizenship that is given to people from former colonies straight away. So, guys, you've been listening to the Myriad Show. Please do leave a comment, like this video, share this video, and until next time, you've been listening to your host, 𝐵𝐸𝐿𝐼 on the Myriad Show, and I'll catch you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.